Okay, so last week we had another announcement from our devoted Chancellor, and this was related to an update in the job support scheme, which was announced previously on September the 24th. So this information that I'm about to give you is correct as at the 22nd of October 2020 and is being brought to you by me. I am Jeremy Lieboff, partner at Sobel Roads, and this is another one of our videos in relation to the Sobel Roads playbook, and this is the job support scheme updated. So as I mentioned, on the 24th of September, the Chancellor announced the job support scheme, which will be taking over from the job retention scheme, which has been in place since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. This is all part of the winter economy plan. This is aimed at protecting employees and employers for the 6-month period that starts from the 1st of November 2020. And this was with the idea of supporting through grants, whereby people who are having reduced hours down to 33% of their normal working hours would still receive 2/3 of that unpaid element or unworked element. But since the coronavirus has been resurgent in the UK recently, and the whole new 3-tier system has been put into place, some businesses are facing closure, and this has led to an update to the job support scheme, and that's what this is all about. So the big thing is that the job support scheme has been split into 2 different types. We've got JSS Open, Job Support Scheme Open, and JSS Closed. JSS Open relates to those businesses that are trading but are subject to having reduced demand because of the COVID pandemic. There are specific criteria that are in place about what they can and can't do, and we'll come on to that. JSS Closed, however, is aimed at those businesses who are legally required to close because of the coronavirus restrictions that have been put in place in their area by one of the 4 UK governments. The criteria that we've been given, the information we've been given at this moment is just the cursory, the primary information, well, as opposed to JSS Open, which essentially is enhanced from the original announcement on the 24th of September. These are the main things that have been discussed here, and this announcement outlined not only the eligibility criteria, but also the conditions for the JSS scheme, and also giving us the heads up that there will be further information to be announced at the end of October. So stay tuned, there's probably another one of these on its way. So JSS Open, which was just JSS until last week, what's changed? Well, the big thing is that the minimum number of hours in the original announcement was that you were doing 33% of your usual hours. That's now been dropped down to 20%. So therefore more people are going to be able to be found eligible under this particular reduction, which is good news for employees, obviously. The other thing is that the proportions being covered by employers, whereas before, let's just say that you were working 33% and you had 66% of your unpaid, unworked time, there would be 1/3 of that covered by your employer. Now that's only 5%. So if you got 66%-ish of your salary that's being covered, even though you're not working, now 5% of that is covered by the employer, which is much better for the employer, and 61.67, to be precise, is covered by the government. So the government are putting much more into the pot. This means that employees could be earning up to 73% of their wages, but there is a cap. The cap is £3,125, which means approximately those people who are earning up to £37,500 will gain from this properly, whereas people who are above that will be subject to the cap, and so therefore that 73% of usual wages is unlikely to be reached. It can't be reached because that's the way that the rules work. But the other thing is that employers can pay additional amounts on top by discretion if they wish. Doesn't have anything to do with what the government puts in or whatever else. The other elements have to be done. It's a discretionary element that you can choose to put in if you want, all you employers out there. We've also put together some workings in relation to this, where I've got Ms Holt comparing the old criteria to the new criteria, and also the same for Mr Giles, old to new. So if you have a look at the Ms Holt, you'll be able to see that in the original criteria, the original funding, the amount being put in by the employers was £556, but her employer is having to put in much less, which is good for the employer. The other example is Mr Giles, who was being reduced to 20% of his hours. Well, under the old criteria, he wouldn't have qualified for anything anything additional at all apart from the hours that he was doing. Under the new criteria, he will find himself much better off, because as well as the hours that he is doing, he's also going to find that his employer is chipping in an extra £91, but the government is chipping in £1,122, which means that he's going to have £1,668 in his pocket, compared with £455 had this change not been put in place. So then that brings us to JSS Closed, and which is slightly different from JSS Open. It's a bit more like the job retention scheme. This relates to employers who are legally required to close. So that is because one of the 4 regional governments have said that they are within the tier system that they have to close their business. So what's going to happen here is those people obviously are not going to be working. They will receive 2/3 of their normal pay. This will be covered fully by the government. So it's being paid out by the employer, who will then claim it back from the government. Government funding is, however, capped at just over £2,000, £2,083.33 to be precise. Employers can pay more at their discretion, but they won't receive any additional funding. But it's worth knowing that employees are also entitled to, should they qualify, universal credit as well. They are not going to be penalised for being under the job support scheme if that's the case. So having dealt with some of the nuances between the two schemes, let's have a look at some of the things that actually bring them together. So who's eligible? Let's have a look at the employers first. Under both schemes, an employer can claim for both JSS Open and JSS Closed at the same time. So this might be a situation whereby you've got a multi-outlet business, and they've got some that are in an area where they have to close and some where they're in an area that they are open, which means they will have a combination of the two. That's absolutely fine. They can't, however, claim for the same person under both schemes at the same time. They are either in one or the other. So that's something that just to be aware of, but it's some nuance, and it's not going to be something that's massively common across the board. You have to be, as with all the other schemes that we've seen previously, enrolled for PAYE online. This is all done online. You must have a UK, Channel Island or Isle of Man bank account. Organisations that are publicly funded, you need to take advice, because many that are fully publicly funded will find that they cannot get anything under the job support scheme. In fact, they cannot, but those that are partly funded, you need to take advice, because there may be different rules and criteria in place for you. So that's the employers, but what about the employees? Well, employees have to have been registered on an RTI submission, a full payment submission, at some point between the 6th of April 2019, so that's quite a while ago, and 11:59 PM, quite precise, on the 23rd of 2020. So there has to have been a submission with that person, a full payment submission that's been put in at that with that person's name on it. Employees which would still need to have been employed on the 23rd of September this year, but a bit like we had with the furlough scheme, if they have been ceased employment since then and then re-employed, then that's okay. They will also be able to be qualifying under the job support scheme themselves. So that's good news. Employees can have any type of contract. It can be 0 hours contract, it can be temporary contract, but they have to have been treated as an employee for income tax purposes. Same for agency workers. They are regarded as employees of an employment agency for the purposes of this scheme. So what are the next steps? Well, the scheme opens up on the 8th of December 2020. It's going to be covering the periods from the 1st of November 2020 to the 30th of April 2021. It's a 6-month period, and it will be subject to some sort of review in January 2021, although we're expecting loads more announcements. Well, not maybe loads more, but some more announcements as to exactly what the nuances and the details of the scheme are between now and then anyway. Claims will be made in arrears, and therefore you would receive the money after you have made payments to the employees. That's a very important thing. So for the example, employees are paid in November, you put in the claim on the 8th of December, and boom, then hopefully the money will be put through. Neither the employee or the employer needs to have benefited in any way, shape or form under the coronavirus job retention scheme. They're actually two separate things, so that's not something you need to be worrying about. And as I say, we're expecting further guidance to be published in due course. Other things you need to know about the JSS Open scheme is that they provide additional guidance at the moment in relation to training and national minimum wage and working tax credits and parental leave. You need to read through that, because there's an awful lot in there to digest, and you don't want me getting into the nitty-gritty on this video. Similarly, those employers who have got more than 250 employees, they will need to undertake a financial impact test. Again, details of that have been provided, but I'm not going to get into it here. It's just far too large to get into, and outside the scope of what this video is covering. Equality and discrimination laws apply in all the usual ways, so be aware of that. It's very important when making decisions as to who is going to go into the scheme and who is not. When it comes to JSS closed, one or more business premises have to have been forced to close because of the coronavirus restrictions, and it's been set by one of the 4 UK governments. Please be aware that if it's something to do with a local issue, a local government issue, a public health issue in your area, that is not the same and therefore is not covered by the JSS closed scheme. It's only valid during periods when the restrictions are in place. So if that property or that business is therefore able to open up because the government in question has lifted the restrictions, then the JSS closed scheme will cease and JSS open scheme will become the appropriate way to proceed. There's a load of other bits and bobs that have been thrown into this now, so it's worth knowing them. I'm going to go through it fast. Mind you, I always go through these fast, so please be aware of them. But things like you must have written contracts put in place. They will need to be requested. They could be requested by HMRC to view at any particular moment in time. Temporary working agreements that you put in place have to cover at least 7 days. Records need to be kept for 5 years. The employees must agree to the arrangements. The scheme doesn't cover employers' national insurance or pension contributions. This is important. We saw previously, under the beginnings of the job retention scheme, that it covered pensions and employers' national insurance. This scheme doesn't. You're getting a lot of support from the government when it comes to the paying of the wages, but employers' national insurance and pension contributions, that has to be covered by the employer. So be aware of that. It may not necessarily be relevant to everybody, but it's definitely going to be relevant to some. Anyway, the employers will need to pay over their NI, their PAYE, student loans, apprenticeship and everything else as normal, and employees must have been paid in full before any claim is made. And the truth is, it goes on and on and on. Employers cannot claim for an employee who's been made redundant or is serving their redundancy at that particular time. The government expects that large employers will not be making dividend payments or other capital distributions whilst claiming under the job support scheme. It sounds like stuff that might be obvious, but they're starting to put these in because there has been a lot of fraud related to the job retention scheme. We're expecting fraud checks to be increased, and they're also talking about 100% penalties where appropriate. HMRC are planning to publish the names of the employers who are using the scheme so that employees are able to have a look, and employees will have a note on their personal tax records if their employer has included their name in a job support scheme claim. So they're starting to come down and kind of get to grips with how are we going to stop people making fraudulent claims. Be aware of this. One of the other things that's worth noting though is that when it comes to the end of October, beginning of November, depending on timing of periods and payroll periods, it is actually possible for an employee to appear on both a job retention scheme and a job support scheme claim for that period. Let's just say that your period runs from the 20th of October to the 14th of November. Then you may well have a JRS claim and a JSS claim for the same employee, which is actually quite possible. There's an awful lot in there, and I've gone through it fast to try and cover as much as possible in a short period of time. You can watch it back in slow speed or high speed, whatever meets your viewing pleasure. But be aware, be aware that our team, our tax team, as always, are there and available to be able to help our clients with JSS calculations, JSS submissions, because PAYE registered agents can do that on behalf of their clients, so that's all good. If you've got any questions or queries, contact Tim Knight, our tax director, at our offices on the usual number. Also working alongside this, our business consultancy department is doing a lot of work in terms of business preparation and planning in relation to some of the other elements of COVID, so you might want to catch those on some of our other videos, especially when we're looking at cash planning and forward planning, but you can always give a call to Mark Rhodes, our director of business consultancy, also at the usual number. Once again, thank you very much for sitting through this and listening to me ramble on about what is clearly one of the most exciting subjects that you could find on the internet today. But apart from anything else, and more importantly than anything else, please stay safe, and we look forward to coming back to you soon. As soon as we know more, then we'll let you know.